Kuzambo, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sangye Choiphel, and welcome to the 4th International Conference on Vajrayana Buddhism. And as part of the conference, we are also talking to some of our guest speakers. And tonight, here in the studio, right here at Center for Bhutan Studies, is my guest. She's a prominent adult psychiatrist as well as family and systemic psychotherapist. She is no other than Dr. Caroline Van Damme. Welcome to the show, Doctor.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
How are you?
I'm very good and I'm very well, thank you. I've been in Bhutan it's the first time I'm in Bhutan. Mm-hmm. You have a beautiful country.
Oh, thank you very much.
I'm really amazed by it, very much. Yes, yes.
Well, Doctor, can you please tell us a little bit about what you do?
So what I do, I am a psychiatrist. I'm an adult psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a child psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm.
And I work in what we call, in English, because that's not the real name,
Mm-hmm.
we call it a Brussels Night Hospital.
Mm-hmm.
It's based in Brussels,
Mm-hmm.
Brussels, which is the capital city of our country. It's located in the city center,
Mm-hmm.
and we call it a night hospital because we are working with people who suffer from severe mental illness, more precisely people who suffer from psychotic disorders, mostly people who suffer from schizophrenia, but also people with bipolar disorders or schizoaffective disorders. You have all kinds of names, but for me, it's really the psychosis that is important that we look at. The diagnostic labels are not so important in my view. And we call it a night hospital because we try to help our patients, so we do what we call psychosocial rehabilitation.
Mm-hmm.
We try to help them be part of the community again. Because many of them, because of their psychotic breakdowns, got into such situations that they lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they had conflicts with family and friends, and so we try to help them regain a part in the community. And where they find meaningful daily activities, so where they find either a job that's adapted to them or doing some volunteering, and then help them to get on a government allocation, that they receive money from the government just to live, or to do some studies. Many of them want to learn, go back to school, learn new languages. As you know, Brussels is really in the center, the heart of Europe, as we say. So there are many communities, many languages. Even Belgium, which is a super small country, already has 3 official languages,
yes,
which is French, Dutch, and German. So already learning languages is part of, what we try, so that they really have something that they can do. And that they are part of the community. Okay. We also help them find an adapted place to live, either find an apartment or sheltered living. So we also have houses of sheltered living, which means that they live with relative autonomy, but they receive help from social workers for certain problems they might encounter with paperwork and everything. And we also do psychiatric care at home, which means that people who still have their house and apartment, we go to their apartments and we help them right from there to avoid having trouble and also avoid hospitalization. Sure. And so we work, it's a really multidisciplinary approach. Of course, there is a medical approach. I'm a doctor, so I prescribe medication, but there is also, we have psychologists, social workers, pedagogues, I don't know how you say exactly in English, but we really work in a team, and it's really on the long run, so we really get to know our patients. It's also one of the smallest hospitals of the country. Sure. And so we are, now we are 3 psychiatrists and 1 resident. And we take care of about 200 patients.
Wow. So it seems it's a very hands-on approach to taking care of your patients so that you could rehabilitate them for them to become a part of the community. Yes. In a lot of ways.
Yes. And that's why it's a night hospital. Sure. So the night hospital is only for hospitalization. We call it partial residential hospitalization, when they need hospitalization for a while. And we say it's night because during the daytime we want them to
go out in the community.
To go out and to be part of the community.
Sure.
So we help them, to find, to help them with all the work that needs to be done
Sure.
to find.
To integrate them back into society.
Yes.
That's so wonderful. But nowadays it's becoming even more essential to talk about mental health and how important it is to talk about mental health. What is mental health and how important is it to talk about mental health?
Yes, so mental health in the past used to be defined very simply as the absence of disease.
Mm.
Now we know it's more complicated than that because the human mind is complicated.
Right.
So now the WHO has its own definition, which was defined yesterday by one of the speakers. I think there are 4 elements in it. The first one is that the person has a mental well-being where he can actualize his own potential. Second one is that he can cope with the normal stresses of life in a normal way, because we all have stress in our life. Well, that doesn't mean we all have mental disorders. Then that he can contribute in a positive way to the community, that he feels part of the community and that he feels meaningful in the community. That's really important, and especially today, where we live in a more and more individualistic society. People are more and more lonely. Many people don't live with their families anymore, and so they feel that they don't contribute in a meaningful way to the society. And the 4th one, I just forgot. I suppose it. Otherwise, you just go on the internet and you read WHO definition.
So
of mental
WHO
health.
has their own definition about what is mental health.
Yes.
Now, obviously, not everybody suffers from mental illness or issues regarding the mental health. Who is at risk of mental illness?
Well, so who is at risk of mental illness? Well, to start with, there is a genetic risk.
Sure.
But it's not because you carry the gene that you will develop mental illness. So that we really need to know it when they have done studies on identical twins. If one develops mental illness, doesn't mean that the other one definitely will get it too, although they have the exact same genes.
Sure.
So the genes put you at risk more than other genes, but it's not a guarantee that you will get the mental illness, which is very good news. So there is a genetic risk. How do I know if I have a genetic risk? Well, if it runs in a family. If I have family members who suffer from mental illness, who have if there's someone with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, if there is depression, recurring depression, or if there is suicide in the family, be careful. Secondly, stress and trauma in life will increase the risk of developing mental illness. People who have traumatic experiences, of course, who have abuse histories or of very difficult family situations, being bullied at school. And also what is stressful can vary from one person to another. Something can be very distressing for one person and not at all for someone else.
Sure.
So for example, you can have siblings and the parents divorce. For one of the siblings, it's very distressing. For the other one, it will not be. So we need to look at that, what is stressful for people. So if you have a lot of stress that you experience as extremely distressing in your childhood, in your young age of adulthood, then you should be careful, especially if in the family there is a genetic risk. And then lastly, those people that I just talked about should be very careful with drugs. I don't know how it is in Bhutan, but in Belgium, cannabis is not legalized, but it's depenalized. So it means if you consume cannabis, you will not go to prison, but you can't buy it, and you can't. So it's a very strange situation.
So how does cannabis affect in terms of somebody's mental health?
Well, it triggers the start of a psychotic illness, for example.
Sure.
So for people who are at risk of psychotic illness, cannabis definitely plays a role that is not good for them. It will increase the risk of developing the disorder. And the problem also is when they do get the disorder, it will be much harder to treat if they continue to consume substances like cannabis. Yes.
What about in terms of alcohol?
Well, alcohol and psychosis, there's no real link between the two, but of course there are many other mental health issues where alcohol will be like a comorbidity, where people feel so bad that they start to drink to feel better. And then the more comorbidities you have, if you have depression plus alcohol, will be much more difficult to treat.
It's a multiplying effect.
It's a multiplying effect, yes.
Now, Doctor, you mentioned a little bit about in terms of treatment. Obviously, these are some of the causes that can exacerbate your pre-existing condition of mental illness, be it genetic or be it in terms of situation that they live in, be it dysfunctional family or the amount of resistance that they could take in terms of stress. You're more likely to suffer from mental illness. Now, in terms of treatment, now in your paper you talk about Dharma therapy.
Yes.
What is Dharma therapy?
Yeah, Dharma therapy is just I don't even know if I really use the word Dharma therapy. Maybe I use Dharma practice.
Dharma practice,
because, I don't see myself as an expert who knows better than my patient what's good for him or her.
Sure.
So I've seen, since I was a student, I've learned that, mindfulness-based stress reduction, very organized way, was developed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, really good for Westerners. Step 1, week 1, step 2, week 2, and it's like 8 weeks, and it's very
stages-wise.
It's really stages, and there is a lot of evidence that it is very helpful for people who recover. I would not say in the acute phase, but after when they start recovering, then it's very helpful for people with depressive disorders who are starting to recover, to help them in their recovery and help them avoid relapse. And it's also very efficient for people who suffer from anxiety disorders. But when Jon Kabat-Zinn started to publish about it, he removed all the Buddhist terms from it. Okay. Because he wanted it to be taken seriously in the West, so that's why.
Scientific words.
Yeah, to use scientific words and everything, and so it was really helpful because it helped many people. But the thing with mindfulness-based therapy, I learned immediately: don't do it with people who suffer from psychotic illness. Because if you do it with people who suffer from psychotic illness, you might increase the psychosis. So psychosis is, there are all kinds of definitions for it, but it's basically becoming disconnected from reality. That's how I explain it to my patients. But then what is reality, right? So I would say the common reality we all share. So they have delusions, usually paranoid delusions, so they feel very scared because they start to believe all kinds of weird things. They can also have mystical delusions where they believe they are God, or they hear God, or they hear the Buddha, or whatever. So it's very spiritual sometimes. And that's one part. And then you have the hallucinations. Usually it's auditory hallucinations, so they hear voices which talk to them, and usually in a not so funny way, very scary way, and it prevents them from going outside. They're afraid to go outside because the voices start to tell them, if you go outside, this will happen to you, that will happen to you. So they become very scared. So by doing mindfulness meditation with those patients, it's contraindicated because you risk inducing more of the psychosis.
Hallucination.
Of the yes, and the distressing. The distress of hearing those voices and increasing those delusional beliefs, which in fact for me, people who suffer from psychosis, the basic emotion they have is fear, really fear of what's happening around them. It is very scary. When they tell me their story, it is very scary. So mindfulness, so I thought for a long time, psychotic patients should not meditate. And then one day, I don't know if you've heard of the French monk Mathieu Ricard.
Not too familiar with it.
No,
please do.
He's a very famous French Buddhist monk from the Vajrayana tradition. He lives half of the year, I think, in Nepal. And in France and Belgium, he's very famous. He's also the official translator of His Holiness the Dalai Lama when he comes to French-speaking countries. So he will translate into French. So he's very famous. He's written many books. And one day he came to Brussels to give a teaching, and I went to listen to him. And after the teaching, I went to ask him, "What do you think about psychotic patients meditating?" And he's a very well-learned man. He has a degree in molecular biology, I think, or something like that. So he's a real scientist, you know. So that's why I went to ask him, "What do you think?" Because maybe you know. And then, in fact, he did know. He had read some articles about psychosis and meditation. And he told me there are just some small pilot studies which have been done with it, but not so much. You know what? You just try it and see what happens. You meditate with your patients. So then, boosted by what Mathieu Ricard had told me, I thought, well, why not? So I decided to give it a try, and so I think, yeah. So I tried very simple meditation with my patients. Where I want to avoid all the risks of making them more psychotic. So what I do is super adapted for them, ultra simple, and so I think that we can use Dharma practice to help patients with mental health issues. Yes, go ahead.
Sure. But you mentioned you practice in a safe way.
Yes.
What are the risks and what are the benefits specifically with Dharma practice with the patients, especially who are suffering from mental illness?
Well, I believe Dharma practice can be like, we can use the metaphor of see it as medicine. And as medicine that I prescribe to, medicine can be a medicine or it can be a poison, depending on who you're prescribing it to, in what doses you're prescribing it to, and is it useful for that person, you know, and what the side effects are. And so you adapt the medication and you adapt the dose to each individual patient.
Dharma practice is similar to that.
And so for me, I see Dharma practice in the same way, that we should see it as like we want to use it as a medicine and not as a poison. And if we would give Dharma practice in a standardized way to everyone, you know, everyone just do the same thing. Most of people won't have problems and will feel the benefits. Very few people.
The segment of population who might be susceptible
will have
to
harmful
mental
effects.
illness.
Yeah.
I was attending one of your session this morning, in fact, and you talked a little bit about how meditation or maybe perhaps Dharma practice with children, and you were recommending something. Can you talk a little bit about on that?
Yes, I was actually talking about trauma survivors and using the example of children. I'm not a child psychiatrist, so but still, I think it goes in the same way because there are many people who teach meditation in schools. Of course, I'm talking about Western countries. I'm not talking about Bhutan, where it's it's much more culturally accepted. For us, it's really not. When I was young, I had never heard of meditation when I was a child. So it's really something new and recent. So it's not in our culture. So I think I'm really talking about my own country, you know, so for me, there are associations who come to school and teach meditation for classrooms. The idea behind it is really good to stimulate compassion and things like that. I think it's really wonderful. But I always think we should be very wary because in those children, it is said that, you know, child psychiatrists say there is 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 5. It is an estimation because, of course, we'll never know. But it is estimated that a lot of young girls have been victims of, for example, sexual abuse. And so that's a trauma, a traumatic experience, because usually it comes with repetition, so it's severe trauma. It's not just one event that just happens, it happens repetitively. And if you're not careful and you come in classrooms where there might be a few of those children who have been victim or who still are victim of sexual abuse, and you teach them how to be mindful and start to breathe and to be in the present moment, although they have, as a coping strategy, put their trauma somewhere behind to be able to function normally. So they are not ready to face that issue. you might induce this traumatic state suddenly by being in the present moment and being aware that the trauma just comes up, and then they will react like a traumatized person and get into a dissociation state. A dissociation is like freezing, you know, like when you see an animal that gets really scared and that stops moving, it freezes. That's what human beings
do. Goats, I've seen that before.
I see, there you go.
So that it could trigger that type of reaction.
Human beings, we can do that too when we are in a very severely traumatic experience and there is no way out to save ourselves. We cannot fight, we cannot fly, we cannot flee, Then the only option that remains is pretend we are dead. So that's why we enter in this freeze state. And we disconnect completely from our brain, from our emotions, and it's like this. And so it's a sort of protection mechanism. And, but then if you trigger this trauma again, you trigger this freezing state again, this dissociation state again, it's harmful. Especially if there is no one else to come and take care of those children who have just been triggered into, and all the other kids are doing well. And so that child doesn't understand what just happened.
It could exacerbate further.
And it can just trigger a new trauma. It can be traumatic again. So for this, I said this morning I wouldn't do it, just go like that in schools, but I suppose it's still possible, but if people who are teaching this, who are coming to teach this, are very aware of that and have, you know, options where they can take care of those children if in case there is a problem, where they can receive the help they need, or that they can say, you know, if you don't feel well by doing this meditation, just stop doing it. That the children don't feel forced to participate because the rest of the class is all participating, you know, so that
it's a herd mentality.
That they receive the permission not to participate if they don't feel comfortable with it.
Now, how would you, as a psychiatrist, how would you deal with girls who are suffering from those trauma, those experiences of sexual abuse, rape, and things like that? How would you treat? What would be recommended to treat them? How would you treat them? From your own experience.
Well, trauma is something that takes a long time to come. I will never, when I feel, because you feel it somehow, there have been, I see adults, I just don't see young children. So if there is a history of trauma, of sexual abuse in the family, it usually takes a long time before the patient starts
to show
even share it a little bit about it. And I will not ask detailed questions about it because, again, I don't want to trigger the traumatic state. So I will let them talk about it for as long as they feel safe talking about it. But usually they say themselves, I prefer not to talk about it, and I respect it. But I see that people can talk about trauma if they feel you're open to listen to it, but they need to trust you first. And creating a trusting relationship takes a long time. Especially with me, I have paranoid patients where trust is even more complicated too. So I know I have had patients in the beginning were very paranoid, in very delusional states, really in a bad shape. And I was like, oh my God, I went home, how am I ever going to be able to help that person? Medication wasn't working, and you know, it was a desperate situation. I felt completely powerless. That was when I was young. But then over time now, I still have followed those patients. I'm not saying all of them, but many of them. They're doing well now. But it took a long time. And so now when I see young patients for the first time who are very distressed and everything, I know I don't need to worry, even though now it seems completely desperate situation. I don't know what to do. I trust the time, and I know with time things might get better. And usually it gets better because they decided to get better.
They slowly reveal or talk about their issues. Because they build that trust. They
build that trust. And I think the first, you know, those traumatic reactions, those weird reactions, like even psychosis, it's said that it's sometimes, because I also talked about the stress triggering the psychosis. So it's more and more seen as a reaction, a coping strategy to trauma. And so we should respect that, because people have created those coping strategies for a reason, to protect themselves mentally, to protect themselves from this trauma. And so it's like learning, okay, now the trauma is over. You're not a child anymore, you're an adult now. The risk is not there anymore, but you still feel like the risk is there in the present moment. It takes time to accept, we have brain plasticity, the brain needs time to adapt to the new situation and to really learn that, those reactions, those coping strategies were useful when I was younger, but they are not today anymore. And to really learn, to slowly gain, and for me the trust is the basic element for that. If the patient doesn't trust the doctor, it will be hard. It will be very hard. So I put all my energy in creating a trusting relationship with my patients. That's my main job.
All right, doctor. My last question, perhaps. Bhutan is going through a lot of changes, and a lot of our youth, even adults perhaps, we're facing modernism, changes in technology, COVID-19 pandemic, lockdowns. So there might be, I don't know the statistics, but there might be people who might be suffering from mental illness or might be susceptible to mental illness. How can Dharma therapy, now obviously we're a Buddhist country and we're used to meditation or prayers of such. How can Dharma therapy be relevant within the Bhutanese context, especially now?
Well, I think you are very lucky to have those practices already ingrained in your culture. You don't have to find a way to put it in your culture, because our culture is very different from the Buddhist culture, and so how do we translate it into something meaningful for our culture? You don't have that. For you, it's already there. So it's a great gift that you have, and for that I think you are very lucky. The challenges of modernity, I think, are there for the entire world, but maybe more for a country like yours, where the changes are much faster than they are for us, where it took a much longer time. I think we have had television for much longer than you guys, for example.
I believe so.
And so those changes are very, really rapid. What I see that, our modern society in Belgium, for example, I think the most basic problem is the lack of community. So what I would say is really, like in Buddhism you talk about the Sangha, but I think community starts with your family, parents, friends, immediate family, to really be supportive of each other. And I think that's already Dharma practice, to take care of your family members, of your friends. If you have a friend who seems like suffering or might have some mental health issues, you're not really sure, but you don't hear that person, just pick up your phone and call him and ask him how he's doing.
As simple as that.
As simple as that. Because that's what my patients tell me. That's what's the most useful for them, is having people care about them. And so people picking up the phone and calling them. When the pandemic started and we were put in lockdown in our country, I still had to go to work, but I couldn't see my patients physically anymore. I was not allowed to do that. So my colleague and me, we decided to start calling our patients ourselves. So every day we would go. Normally I see my patients once a month. Here we would call them once a week. And we decided with the psychologist and everyone was going to call them, because they were in lockdown in their apartments, but they live alone. They don't have families, and
that could trigger.
And so and it could trigger. They could trigger a new episode, and we didn't want to have the emergency rooms flooded with people with because we needed the emergency rooms for COVID, right? So we started to call them, and they were so happy that we called. They heard our voices, that we were caring about them, that we just asked, how are you doing? We would do that every week. It was a lot of work. We didn't know if we would get paid for it, for doing that. In the end, we did get paid for it, but so that was good. But anyway, so I think it starts with simple things, and we really see that the most basic human need is to feel part of a community that cares. Even if there is the weirdest person or someone you don't really like, that's the person you need to call.
The most.
the most, yes. The ones that are not so popular and they are
excluded from that group, perhaps, or community.
Yes. And so that, and I think you in Bhutan still have very strong family ties, and so it's probably easier for you to do such things than for us. I need to really say those things. But then again, you have your Dharma practices, your meditations, I think if you have teachers that you trust, that you have a good relationship with, and they know that and they tell you to do certain practices, and you do them, but if you feel that they are not, that you are being distressed by those practices, I would not hesitate to tell the teacher, it's difficult for me in explaining what's going on, what's happening, what do you feel anxious, do you feel more depressed, or this and that, and really have this discussion with the teacher and ask him how you can adapt the practices, and maybe stop the practices for a while, go more for a walk in the nature.
Sure.
Nature has also a very healing effect, and you have a beautiful nature.
Yes, we are surrounded
You
by
don't need to
nature.
go far for that.
Right.
So I think, and then take a break from the practices. If you feel they're harming you, take a break from them, and then start again at the lower pace later on. I think that's okay. We're not in a race to do as fast as possible everything, and be honest about it. I think that's also what Kalu Rinpoche was saying yesterday.
I believe so, yes.
We need to be the first thing is we need to be honest with ourselves. So really accept, okay, now I don't feel well. Maybe everyone around me loves this practice, but for me right now I don't feel so well doing it. Being honest about it and go and ask for help about what to do next.
Wonderful, Doctor. Any last thing you want to say?
Not really. I think you already know so much. I'm so impressed by how caring a society you are. And I really wish you that you don't lose this caring part, because when I compare to the society I live in, it's much more individualistic, much more... I'm not against technology. I think technology is really practical. We can call each other on the other side of the world, and that's amazing. It makes life so much easier, but we should be careful that this technology does not make us grow apart from each other.
That is not a catalyst to separate ourselves.
To separate ourselves.
To
yes.
be a part of it.
Yes, and so I still believe that live human contact remains really important. I prefer to meet a friend than to send him some chats on WhatsApp, you know? And now that we can see each other again, I have some patients who sometimes ask me, because it's more comfortable for them to do like video consultation.
So because at least you can see the face.
Yeah, but I don't like video consultations because I don't see their eyes. So I will do it if they, for example, have a broken leg and cannot move, and then I will say, okay, fine, and I know the patient, and that's no problem. But if they can't come to my consultation, I say, no, I prefer you come here, because the live interaction is so much, there is so much more in a live interaction than on the phone, on chat, definitely. So we really need to invest in live contact to each other, because that's really what's helping people and helping them to feel less lonely if they feel lonely.
Well, thank you very much, Doctor. And there we have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was a conversation with Dr. Caroline Van Damme.
Thank you.